Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of A Mic on the Podium with me, Michael Seal. If you're a fan of this podcast and have an interest in conductors and conducting, may I suggest subscribing to our supporters club over at patreon.com/A Mic on the Podium. With 6 different levels of subscription, starting from just £5 a month, you can join many other subscribers in enjoying exclusive extra bonus mini-episodes, interviews with prominent figures in the world of classical music, group and personal Zoom meetings, and even the chance to have conducting lessons from myself. The details are in the show notes below. It's quick and easy to join, and I'd love to see you come and join the conversation all about conducting with the other subscribers and myself very soon. Today, I conduct a conversation with a young English conductor who, after studying in Dublin and Vienna, went on to win the 2015 Aspen Conducting Prize. Since then, he's conducted in both the Opera House and on the concert stage all across Europe. It's a pleasure to welcome George Jackson. George, lovely to meet you, see you, speak to you today. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, Mike. How are you?
I'm okay. Yeah, we're just one day before another set of lockdown rules get lifted. And, you know, we can maybe go to a pub garden and have our hair cut again. It's not long, is it? With the light is at the end of the tunnel.
I think so. I'm also definitely not maybe. I think we're definitely going to a pub garden tomorrow. Yeah. So yeah, I've already booked in. I'm taking my dad for a pint tomorrow afternoon, which I'm looking forward to. Absolutely.
Very good. Well, you've just mentioned your dad. Let's find out whether he had any influence at all in your earliest musical experiences. Musical family or not?
Not musical family. I mean, they love music and they certainly exposed me to music from an early age. But actually, it's a family of actors. It's more of a theatrical family. So both of my parents are actors, although my mum retrained and works for the NHS now. And my sister is a casting director for film and TV. So there's a huge feeling of theatre and kind of drama, I suppose you could say, around the house. But actually, the musical side was something that really happened sort of on my own, with, of course, with their encouragement. But it's always been completely outside.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, if you grow up in a family that is surrounded by the arts, you know, music's going to come into your life quite quickly, even though, you know, they may well be on the stage, whatever else, but you're going to encounter music, aren't you?
You are. And I think just even the simple idea that you're going to pursue a career in something that's pretty unusual, very, very difficult, very competitive, different from the kind of everyday mold. I think even having that kind of understanding and support is a huge advantage because, of course, it's quite an unusual thing to be, you know, certainly as a conductor, you're going for something which happens later anyway. You certainly spend your 20s in a sort of holding pattern, potentially even your 30s in a holding pattern. So It's a long one. And so having that understanding and that sort of, you know, I suppose, unconditional support for pursuing something different. So really, definitely something that's very privileged, I can say.
Well, I went to your website and discovered that you played the violin. Was that your first instrument? Did you start on the violin?
That's right. I didn't. I started as a piano player, very young, 5 or 6. And I remember after about 6 or 7 months, I just didn't practice. I refused to practice. And it got to a point where the teacher, Mrs. Hunt, who I still remember, who was just down the road from us, used to walk around there. She just said to my parents, listen, he's not practicing. And there's no point in him coming to these lessons because he's not practicing. So my parents just said very honestly, you know, they didn't have a culture of kind of pushing me to do something I didn't want to do.
Yeah.
So they just said, well, we're not going to pay for the lessons anymore. So we'll leave you to it. So I continued playing and, you know, improvising and doing different things, but I stopped having lessons, which of course I continue to regret being something that would be very useful to have.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. But a few years later, so I was around 7 or 8. And the school I was at had, I think it must have been a quarter-size violin, or maybe a tiny, absolutely one of those very tiny violins. And it was sort of going around, and I expressed an interest in it.
Yeah.
And that's really how I started violin lessons. And so from that point of view, I started lessons, and I wouldn't say I practiced a huge amount. I was always the kid that got a phone call the night before the ABRSM exam saying, he's really not going to get through this exam, and I'd sort of just about pull it out of the bag, maybe at the last minute, mildly passing through. But it was always a bit of a, I wouldn't say a struggle, but I just didn't have that culture of practicing. And of course, my parents, they didn't really understand that it's probably a good thing to say, right, why don't you do your half an hour or hour of violin practice this evening? They sort of just let me get on with it, which I think was good, because it just meant that I found my way to it slowly rather than having any pressure.
Well, the other way is to do what my parents used to do. If I said anything was too difficult or I didn't want to practice, I distinctly remember them saying, well, give up then. Just give up. And the minute they did that to me, I was like, no, sod you, I'm not giving up. I'm going to get to it. The old reverse psychology trick. It worked well into my late teens. I mean, it worked every single time. But I mean, that was their way of doing it. But I'm glad, much it sounds like your parents were, there wasn't a pressure to, right, get in the room, do your 2 hours, because that to me would have then felt like a punishment.
Exactly.
Yeah, which that's not what music should be like. You want to do it because you want to do it. Whether you're let alone or whether you're the reverse psychology games they play.
You have to want to do it ultimately. And of course, it's not always that you don't want to eat vegetables as a kid. You don't want to, do your homework. But of course, there comes a point where you should see the value in it eventually and realize it's a good thing. I think for me, with what was interesting is that I'd always played the violin kind of through my teenage years, but I then started playing the guitar. I got a work experience job, which actually turned into my sort of Saturday job. I was about 15 in the local guitar shop. It was a really quite a famous guitar shop in West London where I grew up, which used to be the place that all the kind of tour managers would come in and say, right, the Rolling Stones need some new strings this week or whatever it might have been. So I used to work in there, and it's probably illegal, but they used to pay me in strings and plectrums and things like that every Saturday. So, it certainly wasn't the minimum wage. No. But I basically just spent the days playing the guitar and sort of jamming with the other guys that worked in there, and eventually started a band. And so most of my kind of communal music experiences as a teenager were all in a band, playing guitar. I was also played the drums as well. There's plenty of videos and photos of me as a kid arranging all the kind of saucepans and things around the kitchen, and just trying to play the drums, which of course my parents were not interested in having a drum kit at home, which I can understand. So it was all that. I mean, the idea of an orchestra came a lot later, and it was always through the guitar or through kind of songwriting and that element of being sociable that brought me to music.
So where did the interest in orchestras come? Well, I mean, did you play in youth orchestras at all, or did it come later when you went to university?
I did play in orchestras at school. There was string orchestras and chamber orchestras, and it was always sort of easy arrangements of things. And it always felt like, horrible to say, but not proper music. And then I remember I went to I must have been 16, and a friend of mine from school who was a violinist, who still is a violinist, brought me to a party which started about 10:30 at night, which I thought, that's kind of late for a party, but okay, let's go. And I remember I discovered that the reason was because it was the Saturday night post-concert party of the Ealing Youth Orchestra, which is my local youth orchestra, of which I wasn't a member. And it was the best party I think I'd been to as a 16-year-old. I met all these people, of course, that you don't get to meet through school. It was that sort of extra social aspect. Got into all sorts of fantastic discussions with people that I'd never met. It was a pretty late party, I think, if I remember correctly, or if I don't remember correctly, let's say. And I think for some reason, I just remember this feeling of, well, hang on, if all these guys that play in an orchestra can have a great social life, then there must be something in this orchestral thing. And so I joined, almost immediately, and joined as a second violinist somewhere down the back, and worked my way up over the next few years. And we had these amazing tours I think we went to Austria one year, and we went to the Czech Republic, and we had these kind of play-a-thon days where we'd go through all the Beethoven symphonies for charity and that kind of thing. And so suddenly this kind of social aspect, basically like being in a band, except bigger and different repertoire. But I distinctly remember going to the first rehearsal and kind of seeing, I think we did Sibelius' First Symphony was the first kind of piece that we played, or that I remember playing, and just seeing these parts that had come from presumably Victoria Music Library or one of the music libraries, and just thinking, well, this is kind of the real thing. These are the real parts and the real music. no more Boozy and Hawkes arrangements of easy violin music and things. And so it was just this kind of big step up. But it did, it's shameless to say, but it really did come from that social aspect.
University, off to Ireland.
That's right.
I've not met anybody who studied in Ireland. Studying music. Was this where you first encountered conducting?
I'd conducted it actually as a sort of a joke when I was at school, which sounds like the worst way to start. But I remember at school there was a chamber orchestra, and there was an afternoon where the teacher, who was actually a physics teacher, who conducted, just didn't show up for whatever reason. And as a joke, I conducted for about 20 minutes and quite enjoyed it. And we sort of rehearsed for a bit, and then we went off and had lunch, and that was the end of it. And I sort of never really thought about it twice. So I suppose that was sort of the first time I stood in front of a group of people. But with Dublin, it was interesting because I knew that I didn't know much about music or repertoire or just general. All these concepts were new to me. I think even opera. I'd been to my first opera age about 17 or 18 at ENO, I think it was. And so I knew that I was not disciplined enough to perhaps go to music college and properly study an instrument and do things practically. But I also knew that I had a lot of catching up to do. I had to learn. I remember once when I was sort of thinking about going to university, just writing down all the composers that I knew kind of just from the top of my head and having no idea how they were related. Where was Mozart compared to Schumann, it was just a whole blurb of different composers. So I knew that I had to catch up and get a sense of who was when. So I was looking around for university. I originally thought I might study something like English literature or something more, still artsy, but not necessarily music. And then I found it difficult to find a kind of university music course that wasn't a watered down version of lots of different things.
Yeah.
Because I always felt there was no point in me going to a university and doing a bit of violin, perhaps, maybe having some lessons, doing a recital, which in essence is a watered down version of going to a music college.
Yeah.
So I remember going over to this, it was an open day at Trinity College Dublin. And it was interesting because it was one of the few courses, if not the only course I'd found that said very proudly, this is not the place to come if you're interested in performance. This is about studying music academically, historically, looking at musicology, looking at sort of how music functions and how it works and all the sort of history behind it. And so that suited me perfectly. I just thought this is exactly what I need. And also it was this famous library at Trinity College. And I mean, I remember just being given sort of an essay in the first week. And she just said, this Baroque history lecture, just go and write an essay and come back in 3 weeks. And so you find yourself in this library surrounded by books about things that you know nothing about and just exploring. And it was a real sort of intellectual type exploration, which I think had I have had a mixed version of a music degree in other situations, it wouldn't have worked. It was just a brilliant place to try things out and to get a sense of what was there.
And to get immersed in the history of it. And, I'm assuming not only was it the history of music, but you were doing harmony classes and all that sort of stuff. And as you say, so many university degrees. I taught students at the Birmingham University whilst I was teaching at the Conservatoire. And it watered down is exactly right. They had half the amount of lessons that the Conservatoire kids had with me, or maybe even less, and it was all working towards one recital at the end of the 3 years rather than a recital every year. And the watered down is exactly right. Yeah, I think you're right. So therefore, you've basically told me you didn't really conduct very much at university either. Would that be fair? Or were there opportunities to wave your arms around in front of people?
The first few years, I was more interested in kind of composition a little bit and sort of being involved in other activities. I remember actually joining the choir as a choral scholar at one point as well, in I think it was my second or my third year. But then as I sort of got more experience, I realized that first of all, there weren't any conductors around. There was nobody around saying, I want to conduct. So I set up a contemporary music group with a friend of mine who's an Irish composer called David Coonan. And we set up this ensemble really with the idea of performing other students' works. This was the time at Trinity College where the Irish composer Donncha Dennehy was running the department and running the composition aspect. So there was a huge kind of international profile of the composition side of things, lots and lots of composers. So we got this kind of ensemble going and did a lot of performances of new works and workshopped things and invited guests in and started things like that. Meanwhile, I was able to have a bit of experience conducting the main symphony orchestra of the university, so a kind of extracurricular orchestra. But one of the other things that was great about Dublin was that just behind Trinity College is the Royal Irish Academy of Music. And I was living actually on the same street, Westland Row, just behind Trinity College Dublin, where I discovered they were advertising it as a part-time advanced conducting course. And what it actually was it was a 3rd or 4th year option for people who were at the music college, so instrumentalists and singers. So I essentially joined that class for one of my years and sort of made up my own version of a kind of mixed course, getting a bit of the music college side, but a bit of the university, and had some lessons there. They were really generous, gave some experiences with the orchestra and a couple of kind of Baroque concerts and things like that. And as I started to conduct more and more, I kind of realized how hard it is, as I'm sure is a recurring theme for everybody. You actually, the more you try and the more experiences you have, the more you realize how difficult it is, and also how much you need to know and develop before even considering it in any professional capacity. And so that led me basically to the point of saying, right, I've finished university. I'd like to go and study conducting and kind of do it properly, rather than, I don't know, there are many courses around, I know, but actually I needed the sort of the from the ground up, everything from the piano stuff to everything else that you need. And so that's when I started researching what my next step might have been from finishing in Dublin.
And you went to Vienna. That's where you ended up. And so how long was that course? Who was it with? Who was teaching you?
So I went on a sort of, it's such a stab in the dark. You go on these sort of audition tours of, okay, so if I want to become a conductor, I have to study conducting. And generally speaking, in the German-speaking countries, if you want to study conducting, you have to be a very good pianist, because of course they want you to join an opera house as a repetiteur and then work your way through their system, which makes sense from an employability perspective. It makes complete sense. And of course, I'm turning up at different music schools in sort of Leipzig and Berlin, playing that really easy late Beethoven G major sonata, which the Leichte sonata, the easy sonata. They know, the panel know, okay, this guy's not a pianist. There's no way.
You're more of a pianist than me, because I wouldn't even know what that was either.
It was just take the 2 volumes of Beethoven sonatas and pick the easiest one, and that was it. So I was turning up at these auditions with these really serious pianists from across the world who were really playing the most incredible, Liszt and Rachmaninoff to get into these conducting courses. And so I had no chance when it came to that kind of audition process. I did a few of them in my last year in Dublin, kind of traveling around. And then the last kind of stop on the tour, which was right at the end of almost into the summer, at the end of the year, was Vienna, which was a very different approach. It was a kind of a 3 or 4 day long, almost like Simon Cowell knockout type audition. But what was great is that they started with all the things that I'd been doing for the past few years. So they started with harmony and counterpoint. They started with the ear training skills and things like that. And then eventually the last day, when there weren't that many people left in the different rounds, was the piano. I could then show them that I wasn't really a piano player originally. And then of course a bit of conducting and an interview. And in that interview, I met Mark Stringer, the American conducting teacher. And it was almost one of those moments where, in the space of a couple of minutes, your whole life changes, because suddenly I was being invited to come and study for what then became a 5-year master's in conducting at the Vienna Music School. And so it sort of happened, I suppose, by accident, but actually the fact that they properly took time to analyze the people who were applying rather than conduct two pianos for 5 minutes and then see you later,
Yeah.
meant that they were actually interested not just in the pure skills of being a musician, but also everything else that came with it. And so they certainly had a really unique way of approaching it, and I think that continues, I think, to this day.
I think that's a much better approach. I mean, I know, I've talked about the Kapellmeister system in previous, at a long chat with Kevin John Edusay about the Kapellmeister system, because he went through it and called it brutal. But if the only way you're going to whittle people down is to find out if they're good pianists before they then get to learn to conduct, that knocks out the rest of the world who aren't good pianists. But there might be a gem of a conductor in there. You don't necessarily need piano skills to become a conductor. I've done quite well, and I can barely pick out a tune with one hand. If I need a pianist, I'll ask the orchestra to book one. That's it. You can do it. It's perfectly acceptable. Mark Stringer, I know, I was conducted by him at the CBSO, and he assisted Simon Rattle on a couple of the opera projects we did during my time at the CBSO. The last time would have been the Mccarriss case at the Aix-en-Provence Festival in 2000. I remember Mark being there then. What's his teaching style like? I know his name came up way back when, Daniel Harding's episodes, because Mark Stringer gave Daniel some lessons and some tips midway through an astonishingly successful career. But what's he like with somebody who starts from the ground up? What's his approach?
Well, I think what's amazing about Mark Stringer is that he doesn't just come from a position of being a good conductor. He's come through so many of the important training systems. He came through Tanglewood. He was actually closer to Leonard Bernstein, I think, rather than Simon Rattle earlier on in his career. But then I think Simon Rattle, from what I understand, met him at Tanglewood and brought him to Europe. And he did actually take on a position at Bern as a Kapellmeister, so in Switzerland, where he continues to live and be based despite teaching in Vienna. But Mark Stringer's approach is he does the fundamentals really, really well. He focuses on how to just the general technical aspects and all that stuff. But actually, at the end of the day, he's a musician, and he teaches things from a musical perspective. But actually, as I'm now learning, almost all the things that he says are always said in the context of what hopefully will become a professional career. Yeah. So it's not ideal for people who aren't necessarily going to go on and learn the lessons that he's taught professionally later on, because some of the things, when you start out, you've no idea where you're heading as a conductor, whether you're going to conduct the great orchestras of the world, or whether you're going to focus on other things, or whether you're going to get your way through a magic flute on no rehearsal in just somewhere outside Berlin, or whatever it might be. And actually, I realize now that there's the psychology, the rehearsal psychology, the interest in historical performances and also old recordings, and also having a real interest in the opera world as well. He sort of just brought everything together, and we had a really fantastic environment with the class. The other thing with Vienna that's great is that you have an orchestra there called the Pro Arte Orchestra. Yeah. And that was basically, I think, 4 nights a week, very, very humbly paid students joining and to create an orchestra, which then became the class. There were two different conducting classes. So one was Mark Stringer, the other one back then was Uroš Lajovic, the Slovenian conducting teacher. So you'd have 2 sessions with an orchestra every week. But more interestingly, I suppose, as a third-rate violinist, I was able to join the second violins and actually be in all of these conducting classes. So in a way, it was almost a double lesson, because on the one hand, I'd be in my conducting lesson, and then I'd sit down and join the orchestra and continue to learn from everything else. And of course, you can't underestimate, to talk about people who play the piano very well, who go into conducting. Those people probably have never been conducted.
Yes,
and
exactly.
That's a problem. That's a big problem. And of course, I don't need to tell you about the joy of playing the violin under lots of conductors to learn the craft. But actually, you can't replace how it feels to be conducted as a way of learning conducting. So I think Mark Stringer tried to cultivate students who were always going to play in the orchestra, so that it was just this sort of very nice group of musicians who were able to do a bit of everything. He used to say, Stringer Studenten können alles machen. stringer students can do everything.
Yeah.
Because he had this incredible philosophy that actually, if you're a conductor going into the business, there's no way you can really say no to very much. You have to be able to say, oh, yes, I can do the Russian opera. Yes, I can play the piano and accompany and prepare for singers for something. Yes, I can. I mean, I remember once he made me play the viola, which I'd never played in the Elgar String Serenade, because he just said, yeah, well, you should be able to do that. And so it was this brilliant, incredible approach, which I think works very well. It was a really positive way of studying.
Well, you really can learn so much from watching other people be taught, because you're not one of the parties. You're not, when you're being taught yourself, you're always under a pressure situation. I always thought it, whereas if you're sitting in a room watching somebody else be taught, your mind is free to sort of collate all of this stuff and think, actually, I can apply that to me in this way, and I can apply that to me in that way, or that simply doesn't apply to me because I'm that shape and that person's that shape. So being in that situation, I think would be really helpful for anybody where they're going to get their personal time, but then we're just watching other people being taught. I mean, when I studied with Jorma Panela for 2 weeks, I learned more watching the others than probably from the stuff I did with Jorma, which wasn't very much and very long, but watching him pick apart the others was honestly more fascinating in some regards.
It's terrible to say as well, but just to butt in, that I found as a violinist playing in those lessons, actually, I was making mental notes of things not to do.
Oh God, yeah.
Which is almost more valuable,
Far more, I think so, yeah.
And especially with the language of rehearsal. Someone would rehearse and they'd say something, and you could just go, never ever say that to an orchestra. Never, and actually that, in a way, coming at it from the point of view of what not to do restricts things down to the point where actually it's quite easy to know what to do.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I used to have friends of mine, one in particular, bless him, Eugene, a Romanian viola player in the CBSO, and we go outside for a cigarette in the break, and he'd say to me, "Oh, this guy, he's terrible." And you're talking about the conductor that week. He said, "You know now when you go and be a conductor," he said, you know all of the things not to do. He said, "You cannot fail." And every time I'd smile and go, "Yes, Eugene, yes." But he was right. You just file it under comments you can't say, things you can't do, ways of rehearsing. Just don't do that. So again, I think I probably learned more from the bad ones than I did for playing for three of the greatest music directors have been, really, I was going to go on and so you're talking about the fact that you played in this orchestra with two teachers, Mark and the other guy whose name I've already forgotten. But then, there's a list of people you had masterclasses with: Bernard Haitink, Michael Tilson Thomas, Kurt Mazur, David Robertson. And that's before we talk about the two people you assisted for some time. Were you doing sort of what we've just been talking about, which is when you stood up and did masterclasses with these people, were you already working out what the gems were? And were there things that you thought, actually, that I'm not sure that really works for me? Especially if you studied for 5 years with one teacher, such as Mark Stringer, that it must be difficult sometimes when somebody tells you something which is the polar opposite of what you've been taught for 5 years. How did you cope with those big names in masterclasses, and were they all joyful successes?
I think the most important thing about those masterclass situations is it's always just trying a little bit of something and seeing what they might say to you. And I think all of those situations, they were all part of a sort of quite a big tradition, which obviously continues, of very, very big name conductors, generously choosing to give a little bit of their time back to the younger generation, which I imagine they had all experienced themselves. And certainly the famous Haitink masterclasses in Lucerne. Of course, Pierre Boulez's masterclasses also in Lucerne were important. This was also the time when the LSO used to run a masterclass every year. In this case, it was Michael Tilson Thomas. But sometimes these masterclasses were sort of a double function, because on the one hand, you got to conduct a little bit in front of someone like Michael Tilson Thomas, but you also got to conduct the LSO.
Of course,
so it was a sort of but I think at that point, I mean, I was early 20s, mid-ish sort of 20s at that point. I mean, it's such a huge heightened experience that you probably learn from it in a very small way over the next few years as you have it as an experience. There's no way you can just, from nothing, stand in front of an orchestra like the LSO for 25 minutes and then learn something. It's just part of a kind of framework of experiences.
Yeah, it all gets added into another ingredient into the pie.
Yeah.
Two more ingredients into the pie. I read that you were mentor, I assume assisted Robert Spano and Eve Abel.
Yes.
I'm assuming with Robert Spano, that would have been at Aspen for a couple of years. Because
that was at Aspen. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And so you mentioned Eve Abel, somebody who I got to know when I was a student in Vienna, but that was a really interesting one. Mark Stringer's assistant, who's a Japanese teacher called Yuji Yuasa, who he used to run a kind of evening repertoire courses with two pianos every Tuesday. I think it was Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, where you'd say, right, I'm preparing Egmont. He'd get some pianists together and you'd go in and you'd play it through and he'd give you some tips. And it was a sort of a much quicker way of learning. It was just a chance to have a go with real humans rather than just at home. And I remember he used to go on these long kind of rants about how difficult conducting is and how hard the industry is and how tough it is in a very honest and very direct way. And it must have been probably our first lesson. We'd all just arrived in Vienna and it was very early on in the process. And he just said, the only way that you're going to get anywhere in this is if you have a mentor from somebody within the industry or somebody who's already kind of able to share their experience with you. And so he encouraged us. He just said, you need to go and write either letters or emails or go and hang around at the Musikverein stage door, just talk to conductors and be kind of bold and ask them if you can assist them. So, which is, of course, it's great advice. And so I remember going home and writing letters. I think I wrote about 50 letters and I picked all the conductors who I knew were coming to Covent Garden in London and who were coming to the Vienna State Opera. I was like, right, I'm going to write to them. I'm going to say, I'm a young conductor. I'd like to assist you. I'd like to shadow you. Can I come to your rehearsals? And of course, of the 50, I think, most of them did get back to me, which is to be expected. But two of them did. The first one was Semyon Bichkov, who wrote me a really very nice email and said, please come. I'm doing a Wagner Tannhäuser at the Royal Opera House. Come and just watch rehearsals and chat, and which I did, and it was incredibly generous, and it was a really good experience. The other one was Eve Abel, who is a Franco-Canadian conductor, primarily in opera. Works a lot at the Deutsche Oper in Berlin. I think he was principal conductor there or principal guest conductor there for a while, but travels around between the US and Europe. And I got this email one day saying, I'm doing my debut at Royal Opera House in London, Traviata. Will you come just as my assistant and just be there kind of on my side of the table? Because of course, as a guest conductor, it's you, and then it's the house and the team that they give you. So he was able to kind of bring me in as an external assistant to support him with that. And so I remember asking Mark Stringer for about 2.5 months off on my first year in Vienna. Please, can I go away for 2.5 months? And of course, yes, go and do the assisting, get it. That's important. So that basically began this fantastic, almost a side kind of hustle to my main studies of conducting, where I was Eve's assistant all over the world. So he took me to Metropolitan New York, to the Munich State Opera, back again to London, also in Vienna. And it just sort of became this little extra aspect of my education, which was assisting on these huge, quite often with quite famous casts. And, I'd be left in the room with these really scary, but, fantastic singers. And it was just all from writing a letter and asking for help, which is an important thing.
That's brilliant, isn't it? That's absolutely brilliant. And also brilliant for him to do that for you as well. To have the, to say, I would like to use you, and then to form a relationship. And the best way of learning all this stuff is from the inside. And what an incredibly, lucky, of course, but a brilliant thing to do. You were a prize winner in the Jeunesse Musicale competition in Bucharest, and also won the conducting prize at Aspen in 2015. how did that impact on your career, guesting wise? Did that really open some doors in being involved in two competitions like that? I'm building up in particular, and for the first time in all of the podcast episodes, I'm going to talk about one particular concert in a minute, but in 2018. But I really want to fill in the gaps between, appearing at the Jeunesse Musicale in 2012 and winning in Aspen in 2015. How did that sort of help the career?
Well, Jeunesse Musicale was a Bucharest competition with the UNESCO Philharmonic Orchestra,
Yeah.
and it was 2012, and I was still a student in Vienna, and I was starting to kind of look for experiences and situations outside the studies to kind of get some more experience. One of the things that Mark Stringer kind of insisted upon us when we were students was actually to not take on sort of university orchestras or amateur orchestras alongside our studies, which is an interesting take on it, because of course that's a great way of getting experience.
Yes.
But he said the problem is you'll develop bad habits. You'll realize that you've got a trumpet section that's always late, so you'll pick up a way of conducting that will stick and that won't help you when you're in this sort of formative growing years of learning. So he was always saying to us, actually the most important thing to do is go out and do competitions that involve professional orchestras at the right time, or go out to masterclasses. So I remember applying to the Bucharest competition, not really knowing much about it, and then suddenly being invited. Of course, this is back in the days where actually it was a chicken or the egg situation, because you needed a video to be able to get to a competition or a masterclass, and you needed to do those things to get the video to be able to go and do. It was a vicious circle. So it sort of happened from nowhere, and I remember going to Bucharest again with no idea that it was gonna happen, or it was gonna I was going to progress. I learned the repertoire, and it was quite sort of standard repertoire. We started with Debussy Prelude de l'Après-Midi with pianos first of all, and then we moved into I think it was the Eroica Symphony in the first round, and Egmont, and then Raval, Sigan, and et cetera, until there was a Brahms.
Yeah, final. I mean, you say standard repertoire, but all of those pieces are bloody hard to conduct. I mean, they're all sods. Whilst they may well be pieces we encounter regularly, they're the sort of pieces that, you can quite easily come a cropper in that repertoire. I did Sagan for the first time very, very recently. That's hard. Yeah. That's really tricky.
The hardest part is standing there for 5 minutes.
That's true. That's very true.
It was a weird situation, but actually it was the first time it was me on my. It was like taking the stabilizers off a bike. It was me on my own with a professional orchestra. Yes, there was a jury, but they didn't have any interaction necessarily. And so suddenly I remember thinking, okay, now I have to work. Now I have to do this, and it almost felt like I'd been, again, like stuck in a kind of holding pattern, learning and doing all this kind of work. And then suddenly I was able to experience the real orchestras. And so, it just every day was, again, wow, they've put me through to the next round. And then the next day, the same. I don't know what the situation is like in other competitions, but it's almost like I didn't connect how the performance might have been in a round and getting through to the next round and being on that list. They just were almost two separate things. And it almost felt like luck. Oh, okay, I'll continue on. And so the best part of the competition was the fact that it was all videoed by the Athenaeum, the fantastic concert hall in Bucharest. So suddenly I was going into must have been my third or fourth year as a student with all these videos from the competition, with a very, very good the UNESCO Philharmonic, with a good orchestra. So in a way, that's the thing that basically paved the way to then applying to bigger masterclasses, and then ultimately to the Aspen Music Festival, which is where I went and met Robert Spano and spent 3 summers there.
Yeah. So this concert, I'm going to go straight there. I've done one of these, a big jump in at very, very late notice. This was in April 2018. I've even written in my little book of notes to my left, big jump in, ! Where you replaced Daniel Harding. Now, that's a big thing in itself. I replaced Andris Nelsons. I also replaced Sinaisky and Ilan Volkov at various stages. That's big enough in itself. But the piece was Ives 4 with the Orchestra de Paris, and Ives 4 is particularly famous for being incredibly difficult. I'll come to whether you had a second conductor or not in a minute, because the end of one of the movements often is done with two conductors. But also I read in the same concert, you were also conducting Les Arts Florissants and Ensemble Intercontemporain, which I always stumble over when I try to pronounce it. How on earth did you end up conducting the three orchestras in the same concert? And what was it like? How much build up or time did you have to learn this stuff?
Well, this all started. It was a kind of a whirlwind 4 months or so, 5 months. It all started in a pub in Holborn.
Oh, like all of the best stories do.
Like the best stories. It was February, and it was sort of freezing cold, and it was. I remember I got a phone call. It was a Friday night, and it was about 9 o'clock. So you can imagine the kind of state that we might have been in at that point.
Yeah.
But I got a call from Daniel's agent, asking me if I was able to go to Paris on the Monday or on the Sunday for a Monday rehearsal to assist Daniel on the Mahler, the Ninth Symphony with Jörg Wiedmann's viola concerto, which was a regular concert series in Paris, followed by a mini tour to Vienna and then a Northern European tour to Cologne, Dortmund, Luxembourg. So I remember sort of, saying, "Oh, yeah, I'd love to. I was free. This is the great thing about being a young conductor. You're mostly free."
Yes.
So yes, great, fantastic. So I remember driving. I think I didn't have a copy of Mahler. I remember driving to, must have been Kensington Chimes, about 9 o'clock the Saturday morning, and just buying the score and then just studying for 48 hours or so, getting ready. And they were going to give me the Wiedmann once I arrived.
Right.
Now it wasn't me. It was Daniel. It was his week, and it was me being the assistant, primarily because we were touring, and we needed the balance checked and all the types of things that go with being an assistant. So I suddenly sort of found myself being quite regularly working as the assistant with that orchestra over the next few months. And at one point, I was in the dressing room talking to Daniel and to the choir director of the Orchestre de Paris. And they were saying that they've got this Ives 4 coming up, and they hadn't really thought about the logistics. And so I remember Daniel just said, "Right, George, you're going to be the second conductor." I was like, "Okay, great, fantastic." And I think somebody else was going to be the other, because actually you need 3 conductors.
Yes, you do, yeah.
Because you need 2 on stage and 1 for the percussion off stage. So at that point, we put it in the diary, and that was all agreed, and that was going to happen. I had no idea what else was on the program, but it was a big sort of Parisian collaboration between Ensemble Intercontemporain, Les Arts Florissants, and the Orchestre de Paris. And the idea was that they would do one piece including Les Arts Florissants with the Orchestre de Paris, which was Jörg Wiedmann's Echo Fragments, which is a clarinet concerto for modern orchestra and period instrument orchestra.
Oh, wow.
With Jörg playing a clarinet. And then the other piece was Jonathan Harvey's, one of his pieces called Wheels of Emptiness, which he wrote for the Ensemble Intercontemporain about, I think, maybe 10, 15 years ago, which they were then playing as part of the concert. And then I think Les Arts Florissants were going to play something else in that concert. So I had no idea of any of that. All I knew was that we were going to try and get our way through Ives 4 in a couple of weeks' time. So couple of months later, and it's actually April Fool's Day, and it's Easter Sunday. So I get a call from Daniel saying, "I'm stuck in," I can't remember where he was stuck, but he had an ear infection and he couldn't fly. The doctor said, "You can't fly." And I was like, "Oh yeah, very funny, April Fools." Brilliant.
He's one of the people I can imagine probably would do an April Fool, actually. There are a lot of conductors I've interviewed and know personally who think, actually, regardless of the date, that's a true phone call. But I can imagine Daniel doing that. There's a twinkle in his eye very often.
Yeah. So I thought, brilliant, hilarious. And then about 5 minutes later, the general director of the Orchestre de Paris is calling me, saying, "Daniel's," and I thought, this is an elaborate April Fool's. They're including many people as he said, "Daniel said that you're willing to take over this week. This is Sunday for a Monday 10 a.m. rehearsal. Right. I'm about to fly anyway later on that day in what I thought was to assist." And he says, "Daniel says you can take over. Do you want to do it? We've got a small list of people who've done Ives 4 that we're ready to ring, but Daniel says that you've studied it and you're ready to go. And will you also take on the other pieces in the program?" And it was just one of those things where I just thought, well, yeah, this is what's supposed to happen. This is what the great
Yeah.
stories are. And so, and also at the same time, what's the worst that can happen? I mean,
Yeah.
you're going to get through it. You're going to find your way through it, especially, almost this kind of repertoire is almost, not to say it's easier, but it's simpler to do because you're not going in and doing a Brahms symphony with the Berlin Philharmonic. It's a very, very different setup. So I just thought, yeah, absolutely. And so it happened, and I got sort of PDF copies in my email. So I spent this whole flight. I mean, they must have thought, whoever was sitting next to me on this flight must have thought I was crazy, because I was just looking at these PDFs of the Jörg Widmann piece and the Jonathan Harvey piece, and then of course spent the whole night studying and was ready to go then at 10 o'clock. And it's amazing how you it's like fight or flight. You just the adrenaline goes and you just power through. And I still can't really process it and believe that it happened in that way, because it's such a bizarre set of repertoire. But I have Daniel to thank for trusting me with that, because not a lot of people would.
No. I mean, for the listener, any piece by Jörg Widmann, I've conducted one and rehearsed another actually on about 2 hours notice, which was the hardest thing I've ever learnt in 2 hours for the CBSO, actually not so long ago. But I've conducted Con Brio, which is an incredible piece of music, and I've conducted it on 2 or 3 occasions, but there's a tempo change every bar and a half, let alone beat patterns. And then we get to Ives 4, where, as George has just said, there are 2 conductors on stage for the end of one of the movements where the second conductor needs to beat at a different time or tempo, or definitely in a different time to the main conductor. Yet there's also offstage violins, because when I played it in the CBSO, I was one of the people who started off stage, came on stage for the second movement, didn't play in the third, and then had to go off stage to play in the fourth movement. And so you need another conductor. But as you've just said, you're with an orchestra you've been sort of in and around for 2 or 3 months, so they know you. They're desperate for you to do well. They want the project to work. So you can't fail in a certain, of course you can fail, but you've got so many people on your side who are there, who are rooting for you, they're pulling for you. And with the rubber stamp of Daniel saying, yeah, I trust him. I mean, incredible to hear the build-up of that concert, but I wasn't aware there was a piece of Jörg Widmann in it, which makes it even harder than I'd read in the first place. That's a hats off in your general direction, George, for that. That's a tough one. At this point, I asked George how he thought COVID had impacted his career path, and how he envisaged getting back to where he was on his career path again in a post-COVID world. As you can imagine, his answer was imaginative, thought-provoking, and very positive indeed. If you want to hear that 5-minute discussion, I've turned it into a Patreon-exclusive bonus mini-episode. For as little as £5 a month, you can get access to this mini-episode, as well as all of the previous mini-episodes. You will also get a monthly bulletin podcast about my career, as well as advanced news about this podcast. You also get an interview once a month with a prominent person from the classical music world who has dealings with conductors, as well as articles, essays, and all sorts of other conducting-based content. The details of how to join are in the show notes below, and I'd love to see you subscribe to the Supporters Club of A Mic on the Podium very soon. Now, back to my chat with George Jackson. When you come to learn a new score, we know that you don't sit at the piano. So do you sit in your room, use your inner ear, and how do you learn a score from big to small and then back out again? And are you a scribbler of things? Are you a red, blue, black pencil, highlighter, pens, felt tips, or are you a completely blank, virginally white score person?
I mean, I do a lot of markings. I did an experiment actually quite recently where I was conducting a symphony. It was the Tchaikovsky First Symphony. And I had kind of a nice edition of it, which was new, which matched the orchestral parts. And then I had that Dover, kind of all the Tchaikovsky symphonies in one, the compendium. So but what I did is I decided as an experiment, because I maintain that writing in scores is an end in itself. The process of writing into a score helps you learn the score. But I still don't know whether I actually genuinely look down at a score at the end of that process and see my markings. I don't think I do. And so I did this experiment where I studied and wrote things in all sorts of colors and just did my normal process of preparation. And then I did all the rehearsals with just the completely clean bright cop score that matched the parts. And I realized that I'd learned the score from marking. And so that made me realize that I think marking is important, but I love the ability to actually realize that it's part of the process, and actually writing something down. I always feel like, circling something or writing something is just another way of making a mental note, which helps you get the score into your head. And then eventually you of course, you don't need your markings. I don't have any particular system when it comes to red or blue. I mean, I try to kind of just alternate as much as I can, so there's a bit of variety on the page. I certainly put things in, like, I'll put an exclamation mark in a circle. For example, if you get to an act of an opera where the trombones hopefully have come back in from the cafe or wherever they might have been, but a reminder, wake up the harpist, a couple of bars here, and just things like that, to make sure that I'm, because also one of our primary jobs, of course, is to help.
Yes, of course.
Those kinds of things, I think, it's useful to be able to remember, oh, actually, yeah, the double bassoon hasn't done anything for 25 minutes. So those kinds of practical reminders. I also sometimes I do a kind of an asterisk with a circle around it, which just tells me that it's something which I'm going to have to rehearse or explain, or at least focus on during a rehearsal process, because those are the kind of organizational things that I think it's easy to forget, when you're in the throes of a kind of first rehearsal or a rehearsal week. But in terms of studying, I think the thing that I find most important about our job is not just to know what's going on there in the score, but actually to have an opinion on how that should be played, or what you think how it should go like. And so I try to approach all of that at the same time. So I'm not just going, okay, now the first violins play this and then this happens here, but actually, what are they playing? Why are they playing it? What's that? How's that relevant to the rest of the orchestra? And in a way, it's one of those things where it's never finished. We all know those pieces that, I mean, actually for me, funnily enough, it's the Debussy Prélude de l'après-midi, because it's a piece which is like a conductor's audition. There was a phase where it was on every audition, and I think it was also the first piece that you conducted at Aspen. So it was always every summer. It was something I ended up doing, and so it was one of those pieces that felt more difficult the more I studied it. And I'm sure you know exactly what I mean. And it felt a bit like that.
I actually do, because I'm conducting it very soon, and I got the score.
There you go.
I opened it up the other day and thought, oh my God, it's this.
Yeah.
I mean, of course, I wouldn't know the music backwards, but every time you open it, you think there's something else there that I'd forgotten, or something else there that's the Lego brick has landed in the right place. You think, oh my God, that's how that works. Yeah. But technically, I mean, it's so tricky. And I actually think it's one of those pieces. I'm going to be conducting with an orchestra I've never conducted it with before. It's such, you start conducting and you think, right, I'm going to be really grown up and not conduct in small beats, and do it in big beats, and then you suddenly find yourself in small beats. It's one of those, you're never happy. I don't think I'm sure there's a perfect way of conducting it, but whether you ever manage to do that with an orchestra live in the room is another thing. It's so tough. Yeah. Yeah.
But I just think generally that idea, I remember once getting an email from a singer, sort of saying, oh, if you're auditioning, or if there's an opportunity, here's my CV. And it was just a list of, I have done 50 opera roles, and this sort of quantity approach to how, and I remember just thinking, actually, the whole point of it is that it is the quality over the quantity. I want to make sure that if I'm working on a score, it's not that I'm going to necessarily study all the time so that I'm 100% prepared, but I'm also conscious of the fact that if I do it 10 years later, it's going to be like learning it again, or it's going to be like adding more and more. And I think that it's very easy to have this approach where you think, oh yeah, I've done that, that's fine. And it's unhealthy.
Very unhealthy. George, it is the moment that every conductor possibly dreads or looks forward to. I've had a couple of yays over the episodes and a couple of groans, which I've edited out. It's the 10 questions, and you may well know that we start with, what sound or noise do you love, and what sound or noise do you hate?
The sound I love is the sound of a live audience laughing. Because it's not something which, if you're conducting the Tchaikovsky Pathetique Symphony, you're probably not going to hear any laughter throughout that evening. But I think what's fascinating, it was Così fan tutte a couple of years ago. And when you have, a comic opera with lots of secco, dry recitative, you're just standing there, while the action's going on. You're just keeping an eye and making sure no one skips any numbers, and then of course getting ready to start. And so suddenly I remember being in this situation where I had 1,500 or so audience just behind me, hilariously falling out of their chairs laughing. And it's the most amazing sound. It's not a sound that you get to experience. And of course, I remember listening to some interviews with a lot of comedians, and they talk about this addiction that they develop to the particular sound of an audience laughing, or a certain venue might have a particular sound, and it's an amazing sound. And I think if anybody has the chance to do a comic opera with lots of recit where they just stand there, they should definitely do it just for that reason.
And the sound you hate or dislike intensely?
I've chosen my washing machine, which is it's one of these sounds. It's a sound that it just makes me really angry. It's and I used to have a washing machine when I was a student, and it was very Viennese. It played the Trout Quintet when your washing had finished, and it was quite nice. But now I've got this for some reason, and I'd love to have been in the meeting where they decided. It plays a minor ninth, so really quite a dissonant interval, very shrill, and it doesn't stop. Yeah. And it just puts me in a bad mood.
The reason why I'm laughing is that the washing machine is a bone of contention in my house. And especially during lockdown, when I've been doing interviews, normally at 3:00, like we are today. And I've banned my mother-in-law, who's staying with us during lockdown, from using the washing machine because the whole side of the house vibrates. And then when you mentioned the Trout Quintet, I started to laugh even more because we've got exactly the same washing machine.
You have the same one?
Yeah, which finishes with the Trout Quintet. So, you made me laugh out loud because the amount of times my mother-in-law would check with me, you got any interviews today so I can put the washing machine on? Oh dear.
I wouldn't mind the Trout Quintet. It's the one I have now, which is
the minor ninth. Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. Number 3, if you had 24 hours free, what would you spend it doing?
Well, I think, as you know, Mike, we spend so much time traveling and being in quite exciting places, and often doing exciting things, in the schedules that we get to follow. So I think I would choose quite a mundane, you might call boring 24 hours that would probably start with something like going to the post office or taking the bins out, or something just really, really mundane. Yeah. And then I suppose it would just be a kind of almost like an ordinary Sunday. I think I'd maybe go to the butcher's and get some lamb, maybe stop off at the cheese shop, maybe come home and I'd do maybe a slow roast, put the lamb in the oven for 6 or 7 hours maybe, and then I'd go for a really long walk while that was happening. So I live quite close to the Thames Path, and so one of the great things, I'm not a very disciplined walker, so I tend to, if I can, do 15 minutes rather than 2 hours. But the thing about the Thames Path that's fantastic is that you have to complete kind of a big circuit in order to make it happen. So, you get down to the next bridge, you cross the bridge, you come back the other side, then you cross the previous bridge. So you basically have to do a 2 or 3 hour walk. Yeah. And so I think I'd do that, especially if it's a nice day. And then I think I'd have my lamb roast and watch a Richard Curtis film.
It sounds good. I mean, I agree with you. When I've had days off on, when I've been away, for instance, in Argentina, Buenos Aires, I've got so many friends there, but actually some of the better days off are when, I just go for a walk. And I get a lot of thinking done, not necessarily always about the reason why you're in Buenos Aires in the first place, but but often, some of the musical things I've been thinking about, I can have a good think and just meander around, and all right, there might be a health benefit, there might not, because I probably end up going for a steak after the end of it anyway. But the point is, it's that thinking time, alone time. I don't put headphones on and listen to music. I'll just wander and get either let your head clear or let some of the things that you're thinking about really percolate inside. And I think it's important in your time off to not be sitting slaving over scores in your hotel room or whatever.
Well, I know a lot of people, they think, oh, great, you're in Paris for a week. But the realistic thing is that you're not. You're in a hotel room across from a concert hall. And, I know that a lot of conductors, they're fantastically disciplined at, the afternoon, they go to the Louvre, or they go to the museum, and they do something really cultural. I'll come home, I want to watch Family Guy and, maybe go out for a drink, or it's just something completely, I just find that the sort of cultural interest stuff is real holiday stuff, perhaps, or something different. Whereas actually, when it's connected to working, I find that the more intellectual or the more demanding the work is, the more non-intellectual the kind of come down side should be. Let's say.
Yeah. Who would be a favorite conductor of yesteryear?
Well, I've chosen two.
Brilliant.
Because it's very, very difficult to whittle it down. One who I knew a little bit and knew their work, and one who I didn't. The one who I didn't is Sir Charles Mccarriss. At one point I had a fellowship which was named after him, just after I finished studying, and of course I never got to see him live. So I got to know his family, and through that got to know lots of his recordings, and particularly the Scottish Chamber Orchestra Mozart operas. And there's something about, and I'm sure you have a similar opinion about it, that actually Mozart's so difficult, because if you're a little bit too fast, it's the most out of control, wild thing in the world. And if it's a little bit too slow, a couple of clicks, then it's boring and draggy, and it could go on forever. And we all know that if you listen to a Mozart opera, at least one of the numbers of the night or of the recording is going to be in one of those directions. But something about particularly those recordings that Mccarriss did towards the end of his life, they're just absolutely perfect. They're so convincing, they're so congruent, and actually they sort of make you think, well, if you've dedicated your life to a repertoire like that, you'll find it by the end of it. And I really think that that's something which he really did. The second is who we used to call Holy Saint Nick, which is of course Nicholas Arnoncourt.
Yes.
He was a conductor that, funnily enough, still even now, you go to America and people don't know him. He's still, they know his recordings, but he's not seen as the top level of conductors, even when he was alive. And luckily, my whole time as a student in Vienna coincided perfectly with his really exciting kind of final years of collaboration. And there would always be a sort of a text message on a Tuesday night that would go around through all the conducting students saying, right, tomorrow, 12 o'clock, Musikverein, so-and-so is rehearsing with whatever orchestra. And the most amazing rehearsals were always Nicholas Arnoncourt with the Concentus Musicus, with his ensemble, because he rehearsed as if he was giving a lecture recital to the orchestra. And then, of course, the concerts were the same. He talked to the audience, and he'd engage you with his thoughts, particularly on rhetoric and language. And so I still realize actually it was almost like another subject of university, going to his rehearsals. And I still read his books constantly and think they're just so perfect for preparing, particularly 18th century music and that kind of repertoire.
Well, I think he's clearly second in the popularity stakes for this question. Now he's a clear second, and actually probably catching up with Carlos Kleiber. Most of the earliest episodes, Carlos Kleiber featured probably 2 out of every 3 episodes. But I think Harnoncourt's really catching up, and rightly so. I think plenty of people have said technically you might not want to follow him, but everything else, the energy and actually talking of energy, I played for Charles Mccarriss a couple of times towards the end of his life. And he always seemed to find the right tempi for things. I remember doing Beethoven 7, absolutely the right tempi. Symphony Fantastique, just seemed to nail the tempi that I liked or I thought were the right ones. As you say, when you get to a venerable age, Hopefully by then you found them and remembered them. Brilliant choices. Brilliant choices. Now, number 5 is, some people find this question very hard. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. Who would be a favourite current conductor or conductors?
Well, it's hard because you're implying that you're excluding people, which is, of course, impossible to do. But for this answer, I've chosen Robert Spano, the American conductor. The reason being that, first of all, the generosity of committing to mentoring and teaching. He runs an enormous orchestra in the United States and has a pretty busy guest conducting profile for probably 9 or 10 months of the year. But then the 2 months of the summer, so July and August, he spends all of that time, and I've never seen him take a day off, mentoring students at Aspen, going through the process of conducting all the orchestras that are resident at Aspen. I remember watching him come off stage. I think it was Sariaho, L'Amour de Loin, the opera, coming off stage and then getting in the car in all of his concert gear and just coming and teaching a 3-hour class on Brahms 1 until about 10 o'clock at night. And, when I hear about the commitment that someone like Leonard Bernstein, he would do his very busy season and then he'd just be resident at Tanglewood, committing to supporting this next generation. And I've never seen someone so dedicated in that way. And, I don't think I saw him take a day off in all of the time that I saw him at Aspen, and something really to be admired.
What is the hardest work you have ever conducted?
I think, well, to answer, let's say generally, and it sort of relates to the Charles Mccarriss thing, I think it's fair to say that Mozart is the hardest thing, just because the ingredients are perfect. It's like being given the most amazing, dry aged fillet steak, and you're just going to ruin it. And so I think on a general thing, I think that, but actually specifically, during the time I was assisting in Paris, there was a week where Pablo Heras Casado was coming to do the Berlioz Requiem. And he was in Chicago for the first few days of rehearsals that we were starting in Paris. So I was in charge of, 2 or 3 days preparing the Berlioz Requiem. And I remember we got to the movement where you have the 4 brass choirs, north, south, east, west.
Yeah, the Dies Irae.
Exactly, and we're in the Philharmonie, and we've got this huge distance, and the chorus and everything, and I just, from a purely kind of practical organizational point of view, not only trying to get these brass choirs together with everything going on and getting everything right in the distance, but then kind of yelling in French at the top of my voice to each of them to try and get them to start in the right place. I think it was fun, but it was really, really tough.
Well, it reminds me of the one time I played that piece, and it was towards the end of my career, and I always wanted to play in it before I retired. Unfortunately, it came up. And the CBSO were working with the orchestra of the Mariinsky. And I'm not going to mention the conductor's name, but put it this way. At that moment you were talking about in the Dies Irae, where 4 brass bands positioned in Symphony Hall Birmingham in the grand tier, so that's at the very top level of Symphony Hall Birmingham, they're in the 4 corners of the room. This conductor was decided to conduct with a toothpick in his hand. At one point, the principal trumpet of the CBSO shouted down and said, "Maestro, is there any chance you can use a baton so we can at least see where the beat is?" Of course, the rest of the orchestra and choir are sitting there. Nothing happens at this moment other than 4 brass bands playing, and in the 4 corners of the room. And of course, there was a shuffle of feet from all of the Brits, but none of the Russians shuffled their feet, or maybe even didn't know what shuffling their feet was all about. But it did make me laugh to think that there were these people, tens of meters away and right up in the top of the building, and he was expecting them all to get where the beat was with a toothpick.
Not easy.
No. I might leave that in, but I might not. We'll see.
Yeah.
See
Good story. I wonder who it was.
Where are we? Number 7. Just to remind you, you're not allowed to say passport, baton, phone score, or suitcase. When travelling abroad to conduct, what item could you not leave home without?
For me, it's headphones. Always headphones. I've the few times I've not left with headphones, it's almost like being naked, because I love listening to podcasts or to talk radio or to music, and especially going for long walks and things after rehearsal days. I just find myself, I mean, for me, traveling, it's like if I can get from entering the airport to leaving the airport the other end, having only taken the headphones off to go through security, then that's a perfect sort of enclosed journey. I think it's quite a nice way of approaching airports and busy places, probably more so now in the post-corona times.
Yeah, and expensive noise cancelling ones, I'm assuming.
Yeah, not necessarily expensive, and I'm not too fussed about noise cancelling. It's just I like the Bluetooth ones that give you that kind of freedom. I have to remember to charge them, which is always a bit of a nightmare. But I just think that they're probably one of the things I use the most, and would definitely feel lost if I didn't have them with me.
What is the one thing you would change about being a conductor?
Well, this, I don't know if this answer's allowed. It's related to being a conductor, but it's taken for granted that we as conductors, we go into different cultures, different countries, different continents, knowing the kind of rehearsal culture that we're gonna meet there, whether it's lots of rehearsals or whether it's no rehearsals, or whether it's, where does this type of orchestra peak in that process? Is it going to be a terrible dress rehearsal and a great show, or however that works? But what's interesting is that orchestras themselves never have to make those little changes. It's always conductors that adapt to what they're going to. And so my sort of totally out there fantasy idea is sort of like a reality TV show where two orchestras, maybe a London orchestra and a German radio orchestra, or another orchestra somewhere in Central Europe, basically change schedules for 6 months, because it would be so fascinating to see an orchestra that has a completely different culture try and relate to a different schedule. And actually, I think what it would do is it would sort of open the eyes a little bit to the different ways there are of working. And I think ultimately, because what I tend to do, and I'm sure you're the same, you see the benefits of all the different systems, and actually your job is to almost try and bring the benefit from the other system and kind of add all those things in together. And so I just love the idea that some orchestras, perhaps even repertoire and stagione opera houses, also change places just to see how they would function, and maybe they'd appreciate the way that they work even more so after that.
It's a perfectly good answer, and of course I'm going to allow it. I wish more people would bring it up.
Maybe Channel 4 will start a reality TV show where that happens.
Do orchestra swap.
Like Wife Swap. If you remember Wife Swap from about 20 years ago.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah.
Number 9. What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
I think I'd be a political journalist, because first of all, I'm fascinated by what goes on in politics, not just local, but also kind of geopolitics, I suppose. It's really interesting. And that's probably my biggest hobby outside music is following things going on all over the world and what's going on everywhere. But also, I think I used to write a lot, especially obviously as a student, writing essays and things like that. And of course, you don't get to write very much other than the odd email and things. But actually, I really like the idea of playing around with words and trying to make everything as kind of succinct as possible in a particular article or something. So yeah, I think something that involved an interest in writing and an interest in politics. So yeah, definitely political journalist.
Brilliant choice, and not one I've had before. And finally, if the world were to end tonight, what would be your choice of final meal and drink?
Well, one of my podcasts that I listen to a lot is James Acaster's Off the Menu. I'm not sure if you know that, but it's essentially this question, but for an hour and a half. It's a great podcast, and it's often restaurant critics, but the format always starts with would you have sparkling or still water? And would you have bread or poppadoms? Right. So I would choose for this meal at the beginning, sparkling water and 3 spicy, 1 plain poppadom with all the chutneys, all the usual stuff that you get here. And then I'd go on, the starter would be a lobster roll, or possibly 2 very small lobster rolls. So I remember having this in Maine in the United States, and
can't be a better place to have it than Maine in the United States for lobster. Yeah,
it was incredible, and it was it's the meat is amazing, but actually they used a sort of brioche type bun with butter and with salt crystals, and I've never tasted something so amazing. And so maybe 2 of them, very small, like the kind of pinchos that you get in the Basque Country, just as a starter. And then the main course, I know we've already mentioned lamb earlier on in the podcast, but I think it would have to be a combination of, I suppose, my two favorite things, which is British lamb, or roast lamb with a curry. So I think some kind of maybe lamb shanks or very tender lamb, but in the format of a curry, like maybe a jalfrezi or something that's nice and spicy. And then I think I would end this meal, rather than going for dessert, I think I'd go for like a trio of Normandy cheeses. So Neufchâtel, Pont-l'Evêque, and a Camembert. And I think the whole thing would have to be accompanied by a Rioja.
Brilliant choice. And the lobster rolls themselves got me salivating. So, yeah, well, brilliant choice. And it's been a brilliant hour and a half chatting to you, George. Really, really enjoyed it. I'm hoping after this that we can meet up for a pint somewhere and chat some more about all manner of things conducting. Thank you.
I hope so. Thank you very much, Mike. Cheers.
A Mic on the Podium was devised and produced by Michael Seal, with music by Ben Dawson. Next time, I chat to a conductor who was the winner of the Besançon competition in 2005. Since then, he's held title positions in Spain, Switzerland, the United States, and his native France. But until then, bye-bye.